Karoline Leavitt wasn't just facing pressure, she was walking into a hurricane. Years of navigating the brutal legal arena, battling corporate giants and political titans had hardened her. But today felt different. As she entered the courtroom of Judge Alistair Gates, a man whose reputation for cold, calculated cruelty preceded him like a storm cloud, a primal instinct screamed at her. This wasn't just another hearing, it was a loaded gun pointed directly at her career, maybe even her life. The case itself was a viper's nest, a high-stakes government ethics violation that threatened to expose a web of corruption stretching to the highest echelons of power. The defendant, a fat cat developer named Victor Sterling, dripping in wealth and political connections, stood accused of siphoning millions in state funds into his own gilded pockets. The evidence was a mountain, and Leavitt had spent weeks sharpening her arguments into lethal points. But nothing could have prepared her for the glacial hostility that radiated from Judge Gates' bench. As she approached the plaintiff's table, the air itself felt heavy, charged with a silent threat. Judge Gates didn't even grant her the courtesy of a glance. Instead, with deliberate slowness, he flipped through a file, each rustle of paper a calculated insult, a blatant display of his disdain. The courtroom was a tomb, the silence not just procedural but suffocating, designed to break her spirit before the first word was even spoken. Finally, without lifting his gaze, Judge Gates drawled, his voice a venomous caress, "Miss Leavitt, I pray you've managed to cobble together something resembling substance today. Or shall we simply fast-forward to the inevitable moment ere you squander the court's valuable time?" A few smug chuckles rippled from the back of the courtroom, the sound of hyenas circling a wounded prey. Leavitt's jaw tightened, the muscles clenching against the simmering rage. She'd faced down worse than a condescending judge. What she didn't know, what the air itself seemed to whisper with morbid anticipation, was that this was merely the overture to a symphony of betrayal. The tables were about to turn, and in a way that would shatter the foundations of the entire system. The chuckles, predictably, came from Sterling's legal team, their smirks barely concealed beneath layers of expensive arrogance. Leavitt ignored them, focusing on the cold, implacable figure on the bench. "Your Honor," she began, her voice a low, steady burn, "the evidence will speak for itself. This case involves the blatant theft of taxpayer dollars, and I must ensure the facts are presented with absolute accuracy." Judge Gates leaned back, a mask of boredom etched onto his face, but his eyes glinted with something far more sinister. "Taxpayer dollars, you say? Oh, please. As if that tired cliché hasn't been the flimsy foundation of every frivolous case to darken my courtroom." Leavitt's fists clenched beneath the table, but her tone remained unwavering. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I hardly consider felony corruption charges frivolous." For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, his, cold and calculating, like shards of ice, hers, unwavering, reflecting a fire that refused to be extinguished. But before she could press her advantage, he lashed out again. "Miss Leavitt, spare me the sanctimonious lecture. Just cut to the chase. I don't have all day to indulge in whatever pathetic grandstanding you've meticulously planned." A visible murmur rippled through the gallery, a wave of unease spreading like poison. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were alert, their senses tingling, realizing that this wasn't mere judicial toughness, this was a personal vendetta playing out in real time. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath, fighting to regain her center. Gates was trying to rattle her, to seize control of the narrative, to force her onto the defensive. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. With painstaking precision, she picked up a folder from the table, the crisp snap of the paper echoing in the tense silence. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records demonstrate." "Miss Leavitt," Gates interrupted, his voice dripping with mock sympathy, "do you always insist on drowning people in a deluge of paperwork? Or is this just your feeble attempt to compensate for a demonstrably weak case?" The shift in the atmosphere was palpable, a sudden drop in temperature. The defense attorney smirked, the triumph obvious. A few reporters exchanged knowing glances. But Leavitt didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that men like Judge Gates reveled in intimidation. The only way to defeat them was to remain unreadable, unyielding. She paused a beat of pregnant silence, just long enough to make a statement without uttering a word. Then, with a voice as steady as a surgeon's hand, she continued. She set the folder down, the sound like a gauntlet thrown. Her hands clasped together, her gaze locked on Gates' eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel, if you prefer to continue making this personal, I am more than happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have. It was subtle, a veiled threat wrapped in the language of respect. A clear warning that she wasn't going to be steamrolled. The judge's lips curled, a flicker of something unreadable, amusement. Annoyance. But he wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Oh, I have no concerns, Miss Leavitt, he purred, his tone like a viper's hiss. I simply recognize a pathetically weak case when I see one. This time, the reaction wasn't just murmurs. Gasps escaped from the gallery, and Sand's sharp intakes of breath punctuated the tension. Someone whispered, he can't do that. The air crackled with disbelief. This wasn't how justice was supposed to be dispensed. Karoline could feel the weight of the room shifting, the collective gaze darting between her and Gates like a frantic tennis match. But she refused to engage in a shouting match. That's precisely what he wanted. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, straightened a few papers, and locked her gaze on him, her eyes burning with defiance. Then, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady as a bedrock, I suppose we should allow the evidence to do the talking. But as she spoke, she saw it, a flicker in his expression, a fleeting crack in the facade of arrogance. It wasn't just condescension, not just the thrill of the power. There was something else, something deeper, like the desperate glint in the eyes of a man who had everything to lose. And that's when it hit her, a jolt of pure adrenaline. This wasn't just about courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't being combative for sport. He had something to hide. But what? He didn't know that she was ready to expose him. Leavitt had been in countless tense hearings, but this was different, fundamentally, terrifyingly different. Judge Gates wasn't merely ruling from the bench, he was playing a rigged game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to sabotage her case in front of the entire world. But why? What was at stake for him? She could feel his eyes boring into her as she presented her arguments, each word a calculated risk. He was waiting to pounce, she could feel it in the air, the slight tightening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible tapping of his fingers on the bench, a predator toying with its prey. But she wouldn't break. Your Honor, she continued, her tone measured, these documents demonstrate a gross discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in state records. She turned slightly, her eyes scanning the tense courtroom, but her focus remained laser-sharp. She gestured to the projection screen where the damning financial statements were displayed. Now, if you look here. Miss Leavitt, Gates cut in, his voice laced with that same grating smugness. I hate to interrupt your presentation. I do. But I think we've all seen enough numbers to induce a coma. Leavitt glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide his contempt anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, she said, her tone firm but dangerously close to snapping, these numbers are the foundation of this case. He scoffed, leaning back in his chair as if personally offended. And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's valuable time in this ridiculous show. There it was again, that phrase, wasting time. He was trying to bury this case, suffocate it before it even had a chance to breathe. She heard a soft rustle behind her, the sound of her prosecution team shifting, exchanging worried glances. They felt it too, something was deeply, irrevocably wrong. Leavitt tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file, her mind racing. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion. Denied, he snapped, silencing her with the force of a physical blow. She looked up, her eyes narrowing, the carefully constructed facade of composure beginning to crumble. I haven't even stated the motion yet. And yet, Gates said, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his eyes burning with malevolent glee, I can already guarantee it's going nowhere. Let's be honest, Miss Leavitt, this entire case is built on speculation, and a little creative accounting, and suddenly you're screaming corruption. It's pathetic. The defense attorney, a middle-aged shark in a navy suit, smirked, savoring the moment. He hadn't had to say a word. Gates was doing all the dirty work for him. Leavitt exhaled slowly, fighting to maintain control. Her voice, when it came, was steady but sharp as a razor. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before even hearing its contents? A pause hung in the air, a beat too long, thick with unspoken malice. Then, Gates leaned back, his voice dripping with disdain. I'm refusing to indulge this ludicrous circus act any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense, it was teetering on the brink of explosion. Eyes darted, heads turned, and even the jaded reporters in the back were scribbling furiously, their pens scratching against their notepads like desperate claws. Leavitt caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s with a stern face and piercing eyes. The woman's brows were furrowed, her lips pressed together in a tight line. She wasn't the only one taking notice. The problem with arrogance, it makes people pay attention. Leavitt squared her shoulders, her voice calm but resolute. Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. She turned back to the screen, her movements deliberate, her resolve unshaken. She clicked to the next slide, her voice steady but carrying a new, dangerous edge. This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that. Miss Leavitt. The tone was different this time, a subtle shift that sent a shiver down her spine. She stopped, and looked at him, her instincts screaming. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug, self-satisfied expression. His hands were clasped tightly together, his knuckles white, his mouth a thin, hard line. Something had changed, a tectonic shift in the landscape of the courtroom. Approached the bench. It wasn't a request, it was a command. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then, setting down her papers, she walked toward him, each step echoing in the suffocating silence. As she reached the bench, he lowered his voice, just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Leavitt. His eyes were cold, devoid of any human warmth. She tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. Excuse me. I'm saying, he murmured, his tone icy, laced with a barely concealed threat, that some fights aren't worth having. Some doors are better left unopened. She let that sit in the air between them, the unspoken threat hanging heavy like a shroud. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in, just an inch closer, her eyes burning into his. I don't scare easily, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw twitched, the only outward sign of his fury. She turned and walked back to her table, her heart pounding against her ribs. But that moment, that brief, silent exchange, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a power play. It was a warning, a veiled threat disguised as judicial authority. But why? What secrets was he desperately trying to protect? Leavitt adjusted a stack of papers, fighting to keep her expression neutral. Her prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't, not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge, her eyes unwavering. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence linger, a deliberate act of psychological torture, as if deciding how far he was willing to push. Finally, he spat out the single word, proceed. Leavitt didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file, her movements precise, her voice unwavering. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed cost total is just over $2 million. She paused, allowing the number to sink in. Then, with deliberate precision, she placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company, showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. She placed a third document down, the final piece of the puzzle snapping into place. And here is the approval signature, signed off by. She hesitated, letting the weight of the moment crush the air in the room. Judge Alistair Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A visible ripple of movement spread through the gallery, heads snapping around, eyes widening in disbelief, pens scratching furiously. The defense attorney stiffened, his smug expression wiped clean, replaced by a dawning horror. Judge Gates didn't move. For the first time since she had stepped into this courtroom, his face was unreadable, a blank mask concealing the panic churning beneath. Leavitt let the silence hang for a moment longer, savoring the shock. Then, she continued, her voice ringing with truth. Your Honor, would you care to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? It was a calculated risk, a gamble that could either break the case wide open or backfire spectacularly. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she did have was enough to shake the foundations beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, his knuckles whitening. "That document," he said slowly, his voice strained, "is inadmissible." Leavitt tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with triumph. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly." The lie hung in the air, thin and transparent. She let the accusation sink in, allowing the jury to understand the implications. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office, with full legal authority." His nostrils flared, his face contorting with barely suppressed rage. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court." This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery, it was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, everyone was watching, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. Leavitt crossed her arms, her tone calm but cutting. "You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without a shred of legitimate justification?" A muscle in his jaw jumped, a violent tic betraying the turmoil raging within him. "That's enough, Miss Leavitt." She didn't move, didn't blink, her gaze locked on his. Then, slowly, deliberately, she sat down. And that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small, unassuming recorder. Placing it on the table, she pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, the static adding to the ominous weight of the words. "Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Leavitt didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Because now, every single person in the room had heard him. And the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, leaving nothing but thick, suffocating silence in its wake. No murmurs, no whispered speculation, just a stunned, collective realization. Judge Alistair Gates had just been caught red-handed. Karoline Leavitt didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the recorder as if daring him to challenge what had just been revealed. But he didn't. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney finally blinked, his carefully constructed composure crumbling. The smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to dread. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors. The man looked ashen, his face slick with sweat. Judge Gates cleared his throat, the sound like a strangled gasp. "Miss Leavitt, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but—" "Your Honor," she interrupted, her voice unwavering, cutting through the tension like a laser beam, "the real question is, who were you talking to?" His fingers curled into fists, the knuckles bone-white. "This is outrageous," he snapped, his voice cracking with panic. "This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding." "Chaos?" Leavitt repeated, her tone light, almost amused. "I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom." The tension ratcheted up another notch, the air thick with anticipation. Leavitt let the moment breathe, letting him sweat, letting the weight of his impending doom crush him. Then, she reached for another document and slid it across the table, her movements precise and deadly. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation." She tapped the top of the page, her eyes burning with righteous fury. "It corroborates everything you just heard on that recording." Judge Gates stared at the page but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing suddenly louder, more pronounced. Leavitt turned slightly, looking toward the bailiff. "Officer Davies, would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud?" The bailiff hesitated for a fraction of a second, then picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel even smaller, more claustrophobic. "We'll take care of her. Leavitt doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom." A sharp inhale came from someone in the gallery, a collective gasp of shock and horror. Leavitt folded her hands together, her face a mask of implacable justice. I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor. Judge Gates's eyes flickered toward the side exit, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but enough for the entire room to realize that, for the first time, the man who had seemed untouchable was anything but. He was thinking about something other than his arrogance now. He was thinking about escape. But it was far too late for that. Motion denied. He barked, his voice sharp but carrying a faint tremor, a desperate attempt to cling to the last vestiges of his authority. Leavitt raised an eyebrow, her eyes gleaming with triumph. Excuse me. This hearing is over. Gates continued, his voice a fraction too loud as if volume could mask his desperation. I will not allow. Judge Gates, Leavitt said smoothly, cutting him off, her voice ringing with icy precision, I wasn't asking for your permission. And then she did it. The move she'd been waiting for, was the culmination of weeks of painstaking investigation and meticulous planning. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened with a soft click. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor, growing louder with each step. And then, a firm, authoritative voice announced, Judge Alastair Gates, you are under arrest. Gasps erupted from every corner of the room, a cacophony of disbelief and shock. Reporters fumbled for their phones, their fingers trembling. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment for posterity. The jury gaped, their faces a mixture of stunned disbelief and grim satisfaction. Even the defendant, the powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a formality, looked genuinely stunned, his face a mask of disbelief. Judge Gates didn't turn. He didn't even speak. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. The carefully constructed world of privilege and impunity he had inhabited for so long had just come crashing down around him. Karoline Leavitt remained seated, her face unreadable, her eyes burning with a fierce, quiet satisfaction. This wasn't about gloating. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. The judge finally found his voice, his words coming out low, almost a whisper as if they didn't believe them. You can't do this. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney. Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing crimson with rage and humiliation. This is a disgrace. I'm the law in this courtroom. Leavitt finally stood, straightening her blazer, her gaze unwavering. Not anymore. His head snapped toward her, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. For the first time, the arrogance had been replaced by something else, something closer to pure, unadulterated terror. The officers pulled him to his feet, but he resisted, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. This is political. This is. Leavitt shook her head, her voice ringing with righteous fury. This is accountability. The room went dead silent again, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. A lifetime of unchecked power was gone in an instant. Gates's face twisted with rage and desperation, his jaw clenching as he turned to the gallery, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for an ally, someone who would stand up and declare this a mistake. But no one moved. Because it wasn't a mistake. A few feet away, the defense attorney had gone ghost white, his face slick with sweat. The developer, the man who had thought his influence could shield him from any consequences, wasn't faring much better. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow and ragged. Leavitt let her eyes linger on him for just a second, allowing him to feel the full weight of his impending doom, before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm and measured, if you have anything to say, I suggest you save it for your arraignment. Gates's mouth opened, then shut, his face a mask of fury. Because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit, their movements firm and resolute. But before they could reach the door, the developer finally found his voice, his words desperate and pleading. Wait. Wait. His chair scraped against the floor as he shot to his feet, his eyes darting between Gates and Leavitt, his face contorted with panic. This is getting out of hand. We can work something out. Leavitt turned, arching an eyebrow, her eyes gleaming with icy contempt. Work something out. The man swallowed visibly, his composure completely unraveling. I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. He forced a strained smile, trying to sound reasonable. Let's be reasonable. Leavitt studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Then, she took a step forward, her voice soft but deadly. You seem nervous, Mr. Sterling. His mouth opened, but no words came out. She tilted her head, her tone calm but cutting. Why would that be? He shook his head, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow and desperate. Nervous? No, this is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you? Leavitt let the question hang in the air, the weight of it pressing down on the entire room. Then, she spoke, her voice steady, ringing with truth. Do you? Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door, his head bowed in shame. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't done yet. She glanced back at the jury, their faces etched with shock and awe, then at the judge's empty seat, a stark reminder of the power that had been toppled. And then, she turned her attention back to the defense table, her eyes locking on Victor Sterling, the man whose carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around him. I believe we still have a trial to finish. But after what had just happened, everyone in that room knew that this was only the beginning. The courtroom felt different now, lighter, as if the weight of years of corruption had been lifted in an instant. Judge Gates was gone, hauled out in cuffs, and the shock of it still lingered in the air like the final note of a symphony. Karoline Leavitt took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her, her mind racing. The trial wasn't over, not yet. But the biggest obstacle had just been removed. She turned her attention back to the defense table, her eyes locking on Victor Sterling, the developer who was now squirming under her gaze. He had gone eerily quiet, his usual smugness replaced by something colder, more calculating. He was still trying to assess how much damage had been done, how much of his safety net had just been ripped away. Leavitt could see the wheels turning in his head. Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits. And they had none. She leaned forward slightly, her tone calm but firm. Mr. Sterling, would you like to continue with today's proceedings? Or would you prefer to discuss a plea? His jaw clenched, the muscles bunching beneath his skin. This is a witch hunt. Leavitt gave a small, tight smile. No, Mr. Sterling. This is justice. He scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win? Leavitt didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in, allowing him to feel the full weight of his impending doom. I think it means the system still works, she said finally, her voice ringing with truth. That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them. Sterling exhaled sharply, his face a mask of anger and resignation. But he had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, a stark reminder of the power that had been toppled. But it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental shift that had just occurred. One of Leavitt's colleagues leaned in, his voice hushed with excitement. This might be a good time to push for a deal. Leavitt considered it, her eyes narrowing slightly as she weighed the options. She could feel the shift in the room, the jury's eyes locked on her, waiting, watching. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget. But she wasn't about to let this end quietly. Not yet. She stood, her back ramrod straight, her eyes burning with purpose. Your Honor, she began, then paused, correcting herself to address the new presiding judge. Given the events that have unfolded today, I'd like to formally request permission to proceed with additional evidence. Her voice was clear and unwavering, her gaze sweeping over the courtroom. It's clear now that a full investigation is necessary to uncover just how far this corruption reaches. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a collective intake of breath. Leavitt pressed on, her voice unwavering. Judge Gates was only part of the problem. If my team was able to uncover this much, it means there's more. More names, more people who believe they are untouchable. She turned sharply to Sterling, her gaze piercing, unwavering. So I'll ask you again, do you want to talk? Sterling sat rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. He was weighing his options, the stakes clear in the silence that followed. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping in defeat. If I do. I want protection. Leavitt nodded slowly, her expression unyielding, her eyes burning with righteous fury. Then you better start talking. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted, the walls that once shielded the powerful had begun to crack, and Karoline Leavitt had sent a message to everyone watching: no one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, reporters in the back of the room scrambled to get their stories out, their fingers flying across their keyboards. This wasn't just another case. This was history in the making. And it was only the beginning. The story of Karoline Leavitt teaches us a profound lesson: justice prevails when courage confronts corruption, no matter how entrenched the power may seem. It's a reminder that systems, though flawed, can still bend toward truth when individuals refuse to back down. In life, we often face our own judge gates, figures, obstacles that intimidate and obstruct, challenges that seem insurmountable. Yet, like Leavitt, we can choose to stand firm, armed with persistence, integrity, and the unwavering belief that the truth has a way of surfacing. This applies everywhere, in workplaces, in communities, in our battles. It's about holding the powerful accountable, about speaking truth to power, and about believing that one voice can spark change. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope it inspires you as much as it inspires me. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. What's your takeaway? How do you fight for justice in your own life? Let's keep the conversation going.